what's the difference between a custom integration and a non-custom integration, and of Wwise, and for the purpose of viewers who aren't necessarily industry professionals, integration means taking the system and putting it, marrying it to the game engine that produces the end, right? Yeah, putting it together and making it work together. So what is a custom versus non-custom?
Sure. So I would say that for Wwise, we provide an integration for Unity and Unreal,
right,
that inserts itself in those established game engine pipelines and attempts to be a comprehensive solution for audio in those environments, right? And so in some ways, it's to the point where you can install it in your project across those engines and generally just get off to the races to making great game audio, right? Whereas, and that leverages the built-in functionality of those game engines. So in the case of Unity and Unreal, they have an established animator, cinematic linear editor, or physics implementation, all of these things, right? And so coupling Wwise to those systems can be integrated in a default fashion that services the most number of people.
Right.
Custom integration. So now let's just start from scratch, right? And we don't have those assumptions. Maybe the game engine is trying to build out technology from scratch in a way to give them some kind of competitive edge for the kind of project they're working on. So they're going to rebuild the animation system from the ground up, all of the blends, all of the IK, all of the who knows, right?
Yeah.
And it's in those opportunities that you're looking for ways to, partner with those different systems, right? And embed the audio pipeline in them in such a way that it becomes effortless. I think that's the dream, right? So whereas we would say the baseline integration for an established game engine works as designed.
Sure.
We know that many games do not work as designed. So they will always be pushing in a direction or other, and that's where that proprietary integration comes into play. And again, even with a default integration, I think we will always have room to improve. It's interesting to me, we almost got ahead of ourselves in the technical run through talking about the history of integrations or the history of audio engines and audio tools. Again, 17 different tool sets by the time I kind of stepped into working consistently with Wwise in my career. And wow, that was a different world from where we are today.
Yeah, which is I think generally an overwhelmingly good thing for the industry. It lets us focus more on for instance, for sound and music, creating those assets and finding ways to, new and interesting ways to express them in the game, as opposed to fighting with the code to make them work together with the rest of the engine, right? Like that's mostly a solved problem in the case of certain middleware like Wwise. And you don't end up having to reinvent the wheel. I think you've mentioned that in our previous conversations about, all of those 17 different engines were, to an extent, everybody trying to solve the same problems in their own, again and again in their own silos, right?
Yeah, I mean, at a minimum, it gives you something that just says, there's a baseline where we know it works. It lets the creators and the people who are developing new types of games to instead focus on not how do we get a basic implementation so we get sound, but how do we advance upon this and create new ways of audio interactions that we haven't had before.
Yeah, and that baseline that you mentioned, it's not just the tools and the technology, but the vocabulary. Early on, trying to discuss this as a community, to me, felt like having to know several different languages all at once, because we couldn't necessarily rely on the nomenclature that was used by tool A, B, C, or D. We hadn't arrived at an emerging standard for even the language that we use to express things like events or callbacks for audio, right?
Yep.
And so it's been an education for the industry to arrive at that baseline, right? Shared understanding anyway. I think we're doing okay. I think I see the frontier of that undulation with, 3D audio, spatial audio. We still have some work to do to nail down the words we use to describe these things, not just as people practicing the art, but consumers who are trying to check out the cool stuff. Like,
right.
So we definitely still have work to do on that.
That's like one of the big challenges that we've faced. Not just with how to name how we talk about the future of audio, but even on as simple things as like what's 3D audio. There's many ways of presenting spatial audio, and especially with this generation and the new push towards dedicated audio processing, robust audio processing. We're talking about HRTFs and using stereo to emulate 3D sound, opposed to having 3 positional sound in the traditional ways. And we still call it the same thing, except for the way we internally talk about it.
Yeah, there's definitely a lot there and a lot emerging. With the most recent version of Wwise, we have reworked the pipeline to enable what I think of as a higher level of fidelity to communicate what many call object-based audio.
So what is the object-based audio from the perspective of a player? How could they think about that?
Well, I boil it down to guaranteeing the best representation of the sound across any output, right?
Sure, yeah.
So that you begin by authoring in the tools and through the game as your medium for the best possible sound representation. And then we know that we have so many different scenarios for how that lands once it leaves the game, right?
Yeah.
And so to me, it's just about, at the start of the pipeline, ensuring that you're not artificially limiting the fidelity of the sound,
right,
by authoring for what I might call a lossy channel-based format. So you're allowing the discrete position of an object in 3D space represented by the game to flow all the way through to whatever's making the decision about whether you're using speakers or headphones or binaural renderers to receive that information and do the best for the player with it.
Oh, interesting. So the idea is I have a basketball and I'm bouncing it, and if I'm walking away from the camera, I'm an NPC and I'm walking away from the camera, it gets quieter and quieter, and it's in the game, it's going to do things like cut down the volume a little bit and do a little bit of possibly, if I'm moving really fast, maybe some Doppler effect or whatever, some reverb from the stadium that I'm in, and as that gets further and further away, the effects will change, and how all that is processed depending on whether I'm wearing a binaural headset or if I have surround sound set up, everything up until the point where it says, okay, device, what device am I being output to? All of that information is maintained the same, and all the processing to get the right sound for me as the player happens at that moment, at that last moment. So it's a unified pipeline for the processing of all of those things until the edge where it converts from, you know, world game space into our actual reality where speakers happen. Yeah.
And take it one step further. So now we've mentioned the B word, right? Binauralization. Which is not new technology, right? This has been around a long time. We could even bring up the A word, which would be ambisonic.
Ambisonic,
Talk about orders of ambisonic and what that presents. However, I think that from that point, in the context of the best representation of the author's intention, is going to be that personalized HRTF. So the customized representation of how your ears filter sound in the context of that binaural representation, right? So now and again, we're trying to give these technologies the highest fidelity potential to translate for the most specific output.